comment from the Commission. We'd like Valentin Zahrnt, who is basically in charge of ECIPE, who put together this document, to give a few of his thoughts on the debate. Valentin.
Ladies and gentlemen, this declaration has been prepared and signed by agricultural economists, and when you read it, you can feel that. It not only gives important recommendations, it conveys a certain spirit. The spirit of economics, which I believe should guide us when we think about future CAP reform. Economics as a science does not merely say, leave everything to the market. What it says is, carefully assess whether governmental action is justified, and if so, take great care to choose the smartest instruments for correcting market outcomes. Economics, therefore, has a lot to do with common sense, understood as critical, impartial reasoning. We often hear from CAP defenders, well, it all hangs together, a well-kept landscape, rich biodiversity, clean water, animal welfare, and sufficient food supplies. You cannot separate these objectives. Together they form the European model of agriculture, and we should be willing to pay for them by supporting farmers' income. Farmers will then take care of providing all the public goods that society desires. On a recent trip to Washington, I listened to a radio message sponsored by American farmers. Guess what? They told exactly the same story, mentioning again and again how the American way of agriculture, of responsible agriculture is. The point is not to compare European and American agriculture, but to emphasize that we should not think in terms of indivisible models. Rather than inventing the myth of a typically European approach to farming, we should spell out societal demands on agriculture and analyze appropriate policy instruments. If we do this, it becomes immediately clear that some alleged policy objectives are unfounded. Take the preservation of small-scale farming as an example. We simply do not know whether small farms are indeed more environmentally friendly. Even if they were, the right policy response would not be to pay small farmers for being small, but for delivering the public goods society requires. If the legal framework penalizes the negative and rewards the positive effects of farming adequately, competition can determine the optimal size of every farm. And as in all countries and in all sectors, we can be sure to see small and big businesses coexist. It also becomes clear that some policy objectives have barely anything to do with agricultural subsidies. Paying farmers to produce more or to live better does not make food safer, tastier, or healthier. Food quality is not a task for subsidies, but a matter of binding regulation and informed consumer choice. Other objectives are essential to society's well-being, but markets deliver on their own and little governmental intervention is needed. The best example for this is food security. Europe's food production potential, without any policy intervention whatsoever, is sufficiently high to ensure that nobody has to go hungry even if imports were blocked. Another striking point is that some objectives can make sense, but only in some cases and not in others. Maintaining open landscapes can be a valuable aim if the landscape that is kept open has high nature or amenity value. This is especially the case in regions where extensive farming areas are rare. By contrast, maintaining intensive arable farming in a landscape dominated by farmland diminishes recreation and tourism values, biodiversity, and other ecosystem functions. So there's no reason to compensate farmers across the board for keeping landscapes open, while a strong case can be made for targeted subsidies that reward specific forms of farming. Our approach of critical, unbiased reasoning will also show us that some objectives that could reasonably be promoted through subsidies can be better attained through other instruments. In principle, regulation or taxes are preferable whenever farmers pollute the environment or otherwise harm societal values. taxes on fertilizer and pesticide use, water abstraction charges, and stricter animal welfare rules are just some examples. So if we unbundle and dissect the claims brought forward by those individuals, ministries, and member states that profit from current policies, we find that we need a very different cap. We need a cap that focuses on the provision of the few public goods that are really of European interest, and that includes mostly environmental objectives, and it does not include farm income. We need a cap that abolishes all remaining market intervention mechanisms and that strengthens targeted instruments. Last but not least, we need a cap that is financed jointly by the member states and the European Union, and in a flexible manner. Those measures that have significant spillover effects across borders should receive a higher share of EU support than those where most of the benefits remain within borders. If we do not shy away from bold decisions on all these counts, if we follow what our analysis shows us to be the right course of action, if we are prepared to break with bad habits that are disguised as honorable traditions, then we can achieve much more for European welfare with much less money. By taking this direction, we can win surprising freedom in the design of the cap. 20 billion euros would look like more than enough money to fulfill the mission of the new cap, and no finance minister or taxpayer representative would say no to a sound cap that requires 20 billion euros. Even when we add some transition money to avoid hardship among poor farmers. Instead of worrying about funding competition, agriculture ministers could start with the technical discussions of optimal policy design. Instead of being defensive, they could employ their intellectual capital. Ladies and gentlemen, these technical negotiations about optimal policy design will be the domain of the experts. But the broad outlines of the future cap established in this declaration can be fully understood by every informed citizen. And the involvement of many citizens and civil society organizations will be needed to overcome the resistance of special interests. Let us work together in this spirit of critical, impartial reasoning to promote our common objectives. Thank you.